The War of the Austrian Succession involved most of the powers of Europe over the question of Maria Theresa's succession to the realms of the House of Habsburg. The war included King George's War in North America, the War of Jenkins Ear, the First Carnatic War in India, the Jacobite Rising of 1745 in Scotland, and the First and Second Silesian Wars. The war began under the pretext that Maria Theresa was ineligible to succeed to the Habsburg thrones of her father Charles VI, because Salic law precluded royal inheritance by a woman, though it was commonly thought that the challenge of eligibility was an excuse put forward by Prussia and France to challenge Habsburg power. Austria was supported by Great Britain and the Dutch Republic, the traditional enemies of France, as well as the Kingdom of Sardinia and the Electorate of Saxony. France and Prussia were allied with the Electorate of Bavaria. Spain, which had been at war with Britain over colonies and trade ever since 1739, entered the war on the continent to re-establish its influence in northern Italy, further reversing an Austrian dominance over the Italian peninsula that had been achieved at Spain's expense as a consequence of Spain's War of Succession earlier in the 18th century. The war ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, by which Maria Theresa was confirmed as Archduchesses of Austria and Queen of Hungary, but Prussia retained control of Silesia. But the peace was soon to be shattered when Austria's desire to recapture Silesia intertwined with the great political changes in Europe, which ended up with another Great War. Background: in 1740, after the death of her father Charles VI, Maria Theresa succeeded him as Queen of Hungary, Croatia and Bohemia, Archduchesses of Austria and Duchess of Parma. Her father had been Holy Roman Emperor, but Maria Theresa was not a candidate for the title, which had never been held by a woman. The plan was for her to succeed to the hereditary domains, and her husband, Francis Stephen, to be elected Holy Roman Emperor. The complications involved in a female Habsburg ruler had been long foreseen, and Charles VI had persuaded most of the states of Germany to agree to the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713. Problems began when King Frederick II of Prussia violated the Pragmatic Sanction and invaded Silesia on the 16th of December 1740, using the 1537 Treaty of Brieg as a pretext. Maria Theresa, as a woman, was perceived as weak, and other rulers put forward their own competing claims to the crown as male heirs with a clear genealogical basis to inherit the elected dignities of the great imperial title. Strategies. For much of the 18th century, France approached its wars in the same way. It would let its colonies defend themselves, or would offer only minimal help, anticipating that fights for the colonies would likely be lost anyway. This strategy was, to a degree, forced upon France. Geography, coupled with the superiority of the British Navy, made it difficult for the French Navy to provide significant supplies and support to French colonies. Similarly, several long land borders made an effective domestic army imperative for any ruler of France. Given these military necessities, the French government, unsurprisingly, based its strategy overwhelmingly on the army in Europe. It would keep most of its army on the European continent, hoping that such a force would be victorious closer to home. At the end of the war, France gave back its European conquests, and recovered such lost overseas possessions as Louisbourg, largely restoring the status quo ante as far as France was concerned. The British, by inclination as well as for pragmatic reasons, had tended to avoid large-scale commitments of troops on the continent. They sought to offset the disadvantage this created in Europe by allying themselves with one or more four continental powers whose interests were antithetical to those of their enemies, particularly France. For the War of the Austrian Succession, the British were allied with Austria. By the time of the 7 Years' War, they were allied with its enemy, Prussia. In marked contrast to France, Britain strove to actively prosecute the war in the colonies once it became involved in the war, taking full advantage of its naval power. The British pursued a dual strategy of naval blockade and bombardment of enemy ports, and also utilized their ability to move troops by sea to the utmost. They would harass enemy shipping and attack enemy outposts, frequently using colonists from nearby British colonies in the effort. This plan worked better in North America than in Europe, but set the stage from the 7 Years' War. Silesian Campaign of 1740. Prussia in 1740 was an emerging power, a small but well-organized state whose new king, Frederick II, wanted to unify the disparate and scattered crown holdings by gathering intervening lands into a unified, contiguous state. Prince Frederick had been only 28 years of age on the 31st of May 1740 when his father, Frederick William I, died and Prince Frederick ascended to the throne. Although Prussia and Austria had been allies in the War of the Polish Succession, concluded only 2 years before, the interests of the two countries diverged when the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI died on the 20th of October 1740. Emperor Charles VI had made provision for the succession of his daughter, Maria Theresa, to the throne as Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, although the Salic law prevented succession through the female line. During his lifetime, Emperor Charles VI obtained consent from several of the individual German states that were a part of the Holy Roman Empire for his Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, which circumvented the Salic law to allow his daughter to succeed to the throne. While the Austrian Habsburg monarchy was distracted by the succession, Frederick, upon coming to the throne, rejected the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713 and opportunistically invaded Silesia on the 16th of December 1740. In support of his invasion of Silesia, Frederick also used a questionable interpretation of a treaty between the Hohenzollerns and the Piests of Brieg as pretext. What Frederick really feared was that other princes of Europe were preparing to exploit the succession struggle to acquire Habsburg possessions for themselves and/or diminish the power of the Holy Roman Empire. In particular, Frederick feared that Augustus III, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, was preparing to seize Silesia for himself to unite Saxony and Poland. The only recent combat experience of the Prussian army was the participation in the War of the Polish Succession, in which the Prussian army had largely been kept out of combat. Nobody in the court of the Holy Roman Empire trusted the motives of the new rising power of Prussia, and therefore, the Holy Roman Emperor did not call on the Prussians, who were vassals of the Holy Roman Empire, for military support of the empire. Accordingly, the Prussian army had an uninspiring reputation and was counted as one of the many minor armies of the Holy Roman Empire. This reputation misrepresented the fact of a standing army of 80,000 soldiers representing 4% of the 2.2 million population of Prussia. Thus, the Prussian army was disproportionate to the size of the state it protected. By comparison, the Austrian Empire had 16 million citizens but had an army only half its authorized size because of financial restraints. Thus, in defending the vast territory of the Austrian Empire, this small army was more of a sieve than a shield against foreign invasion. Moreover, the Prussian army was better trained than other armies in Europe. King Frederick William I and the guiding genius of the Prussian army, Leopold I, Prince of Anhalt-Dessau, Old Dessau, had drilled the Prussian army to a perfection previously unknown in Europe. The Prussian infantry soldier was so well trained and well equipped that he could fire 4 shots a minute to an Austrian's 3 shots per minute, and, while Prussian cavalry and artillery were comparatively less efficient, they were still of better quality than average. Furthermore, while the Austrians had to wait for conscription to complete the field forces, Prussian regiments took the field at once. With this army, it might not have been surprising that Frederick was able to overrun Silesia. However, Frederick sought even more advantages in the war he was planning. Accordingly, he had his foreign minister Heinrich von Podewils secretly negotiate a treaty with France to put Austria in a two-front war. In this way, Prussia could attack the Austrians in the east while France would attack Austria from the west. A treaty with France was signed in April 1739. The Prussian army had massed quietly along the Oder River during early December, and on the 16th of December 1740, without declaration of war, Frederick moved his army across the frontier into Silesia. The extant forces available to the local Austrian generals could do no more than garrison a few fortresses, and they necessarily fell back to the mountain frontier of Bohemia and Moravia with only a small remnant of their available forces left in the garrisons. Of these fortresses in Silesia, only Glogau, Breslau and Brieg remained in Austrian hands following Frederick's initial campaign. The Prussians were able to capture the fortress at Ohlau almost immediately and use it as winter quarters. Thus the Prussians were able to go into winter quarters, holding all Silesia and investing the strongholds of Glogau, Brieg and Nice. In one step, Prussia had effectively doubled its population and made huge gains in its industrial productivity and resource base. Allies in Bohemia 1741. Early in the year, a new Austrian field army under General Wilhelm Reinhard von Neperg relieved Nice and marched on Brieg, threatening to cut the Prussians off. On the 10th of April, Frederick's army caught the Austrians on the snow-covered fields near Mollwitz. This was the first time that Frederick had led troops into battle. The victory that Frederick attained at the Battle of Mollwitz was a learning experience for the young king. Frederick obtained an alliance with the French against the Austrians, signing the Treaty of Breslau on the 5th of June. Accordingly, the French began to cross the Rhine on the 15th of August and joined the Bavarian electors' forces on the Danube and advanced towards Vienna. The combined forces of the French and the Bavarians captured the Austrian town of Linz on the 14th of September. However, at this point, the objective was suddenly changed, and after many counter-marches the anti-Austrian allies advanced, in 3 widely separated corps, on Prague. A French corps moved via Hamburg and Pilsen. The Elector marched on Budweis, and the Saxons invaded Bohemia by the Elbe Valley. The Austrians could at first offer little resistance, but before long a considerable force intervened at Tabor between the Danube and the Allies, and Austrian troops, including Neperg, were soon transferred from Silesia back to the west to defend the Austrian capital, Vienna, from the French. With fewer Austrian troops in Silesia, Frederick now had an easier time. The remaining fortresses in Silesia were taken by the Prussians. Before he left Silesia, Austrian General Neperg had made a curious agreement with Frederick, the so-called Klein-Schnellendorf Agreement. By this agreement, the fortress at Nice was surrendered after a mock siege, and the Prussians agreed to let the Austrians leave unmolested, releasing Neperg's army for service elsewhere. At the same time, the Hungarians moved to enthusiasm by the personal appeal, in September 1741, of Maria Theresa. had put into the field a levée en masse, or insurrection, which furnished the regular army with an invaluable force of 60,000 more light troops. A fresh army was collected under Field Marshal Kievan-Haller at Vienna, and the Austrians planned an offensive winter campaign against the Franco-Bavarian forces in Bohemia and the small Bavarian army that remained on the Danube to defend the Electorate. The French in the meantime had stormed Prague on the 26th of November 1741. Francis Stephen, husband of Maria Theresa, who commanded the Austrians in Bohemia, moving too slowly to save the fortress. The Elector of Bavaria, who now styled himself Archduke of Austria, was crowned King of Bohemia and elected to the imperial throne as Charles VII, but no active measures were undertaken. In Bohemia, the month of December was occupied in mere skirmishes. On the Danube, Kievan-Haller, the best general in the Austrian service, advanced on the 27th of December, swiftly drove back the Allies, shut them up in Linz, and pressed on into Bavaria. Munich itself surrendered to the Austrians on the coronation day of Charles VII. At the close of this first act of the campaign, the French, under the old Marshal de Broglie, maintained a precarious foothold in central Bohemia, menaced by the main army of the Austrians, and Kievan-Haller was ranging unopposed in Bavaria. Frederick made a secret truce with Austria and thus lay inactive in Silesia. Campaigns of 1742. Frederick had hoped by the truce to secure Silesia, for which alone he was fighting, but with the successes of Kievan-Haller and the enthusiastic insurrection of Hungary, Maria Theresa's opposition became firmer, and she divulged the provisions of the truce to compromise Frederick with his allies. The war recommenced. Frederick had not rested on his laurels. In the uneventful summer campaign of 1741, he had found time to begin the reorganization of his cavalry. The training of the Prussian cavalry had been neglected by Frederick's father, King Frederick William I, probably because he himself was an infantryman to his corps. The training of the cavalry had also been overlooked by the old Dessauer, who was the true genius behind the Prussian army. Frederick had been disappointed by the performance of his cavalry at the Battle of Mollwitz. However, as a result of Frederick's training of the cavalry over the summer of 1741, the Prussian cavalry would soon acquit themselves much better in the coming battles of the First Silesian War. Before long, the cavalry would be more efficient than the Prussian infantry. The Emperor Charles VII, whose territories were overrun by the Austrians, asked him to create a diversion by invading Moravia. In December 1741, therefore, the Prussian General Field Marshal Kurt Christoph Graf von Schwerin crossed the border and captured Olmütz. Glatz also was invested, and the Prussian army was concentrated about Olomouc in January 1742. A combined plan of operations was made by the French, Saxons and Prussians for the rescue of Linz. But Linz soon fell. Broglie on the Vltava, weakened by the departure of the Bavarians to oppose Kievan-Haller, and of the Saxons to join forces with Frederick, was in no condition to take the offensive, and large forces under Prince Charles of Lorraine lay in his front from Budweis to Jihlava. Frederick's march was made towards Eglau in the first place. Brno was invested about the same time, but the direction of the march was changed, and instead of moving against Prince Charles, Frederick pushed on southwards by Znojmo and Mikolov. The extreme outposts of the Prussians appeared before Vienna, but Frederick's advance was a mere foray, and Prince Charles, leaving a screen of troops in front of Broglie, marched to cut off the Prussians from Silesia, while the Hungarian levies poured into Upper Silesia by the Jablunkov Pass. The Saxons, discontented and demoralized, soon marched off to their own country, and Frederick with his Prussians fell back by Svitavy and Litomyśl to Kutna Hora in Bohemia, where he was in touch with Broglie on the one hand and with Silesia on the other. No defensive on Olomouc was attempted, and the small Prussian corps remaining in Moravia fell back towards Upper Silesia. Prince Charles marched past Jihlava and Teuchbrod on Kutna Hora in pursuit of Frederick. On the 17th of May 1742, Frederick turned around and faced the Austrian forces that were pursuing him. He fought the Austrians in what has become known as the Battle of Chotuzitz. After a severe struggle, Frederick won a major Prussian victory. At Chotuzitz, it was Frederick's newly reorganized and trained cavalry that really won the victory and compensated for their previous failings. The cavalry's conduct gave an earnest prospect of its future glory, not only by its charges on the battlefield, but by its vigorous pursuit of the defeated Austrians. Almost at the same time the Battle of Chotuzitz was occurring, French Field Marshal François Broglie fell upon a part of the Austrians left on the Vltava and won a small, but morally and politically important, success in the action of Sahay near Budweis. Frederick did not propose another combined movement. Frederick's victory at Chotuzitz, along with the victory of Field Marshal Broglie, persuaded Maria Theresa to seek peace even if it meant ceding away Silesia to make good her position elsewhere. Accordingly, a separate peace between Prussia and Austria was signed at Breslau on the 11th of June 1742, which drew the First Silesian War to a close. However, the larger War of the Austrian Succession continued. Campaign of 1743. The year 1743 opened disastrously for the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VII. The French and Bavarian armies were not working well together, and Field Marshal Broglie had been placed in command of the Allied army in Bavaria. This created tension between Broglie and the Bavarian commanders. Broglie openly quarreled with the Bavarian Field Marshal Friedrich Heinrich von Seckendorf. No connected resistance was offered to the converging march of Prince Charles's army along the Danube, Kievan-Halle from Salzburg towards southern Bavaria, and Prince Lobkowitz from Bohemia towards the Danube. The Bavarians, under the command of Count Minuzzi, suffered a severe reverse at the town of Simbach near Braunau on the 9th of May 1743 at the hands of Prince Charles. Now an Anglo-Allied army commanded by King George II retreated down the main river to the village of Hanau. This army had been formed on the Lower Rhine upon the withdrawal of the French army under the command of Count Maillebois. This British army became known as the Pragmatic Army, because it was a confederation of states that supported the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713 agreements to recognize Maria Theresa as sovereign of the Habsburg Empire. The Pragmatic Army had been advancing southward up the Main into Necker country prior to this retreat in the summer of 1743. A French army, under Marshal Noailles, was being collected on the Middle Rhine to deal with this new force. Marshal Noailles correctly anticipated that given the problems faced by the Pragmatic Army, George II would take the entire British Pragmatic Army back down the Main. Marshal Noailles made plans to lay a trap from the Pragmatic Army and destroy it. However, Marshal Noailles' ally Marshal Broglie was now in full retreat. Strong places of Bavaria were surrendered one after the other to Prince Charles. Marshal Noailles' French and Bavarian army was suddenly outnumbered by the Pragmatic Army, 35,000 soldiers to 26,000 soldiers. Before Marshal Noailles could order a retreat, his army was surprised and defeated on the 27th of June 1743 by King George at Dettingen. King Frederick of Prussia was terrified by the defeat at Dettingen. Frederick saw that he now faced a coalition of enemies that included Austria, England, Saxony and Russia. However, Frederick soon realized that the coalition against him was not as strong as it first appeared. Neither Austria nor the English knew how to exploit the victory at Dettingen. Marshal No, I was driven almost to the Rhine by King George. The French and Bavarian army had been completely outmaneuvered and was in a position of the greatest danger between Aschaffenburg and Hanau in the defile formed by the Spessart Hills and the River Main. Yet the English Pragmatic Army did not quickly follow up the attack. Thus Marshal No, I had time to block the outlet and had posts all around. At this point, the Allied troops had to force their way through the French and Bavarian lines. Still, because of the heavy losses inflicted on the French, the Battle of Dettingen and the follow-up is justly reckoned as a notable victory of Anglo-Austrian Hanoverian arms. The coalition against Frederick was suddenly weakened when the St. Petersburg court discovered a plot to overthrow Tsarina Elizabeth and bring back the child Ivan VI as Tsar, with his mother Grand Duchess Anna Leopoldovna serving as regent for the child. Matters were made much worse for the Allies against Frederick when an Austrian envoy, Antoniotto Botta Adorno, was found to be intimately involved in the plot. Indeed, the plot became known as the Botta conspiracy. The Botta attempted coup redounded badly not only against Austria, but also against the Saxon and British courts. Frederick's initial indifference to a treaty with Russia now changed to enthusiasm in the light of the fallout from the Botta conspiracy. Marshal Broglie, worn out by age and exertions, was soon replaced by Marshal Coigny. Both Broglie and Noailles were now on the strict defensive behind the Rhine. Not a single French soldier remained in Germany, and Prince Charles prepared to force the passage of the Rhine River in the Breisgau, while George II, King of Britain, moved forward via Mainz to cooperate by drawing upon himself the attention of both the French marshals. The Anglo-Allied army took Worms, but after several unsuccessful attempts to cross the Rhine River, Prince Charles went into winter quarters. The king followed his example, drawing his troops to the north to deal, if necessary, with the army which the French were collecting on the frontier of the southern Netherlands. Austria, Britain, the Dutch Republic and Sardinia were now allied. Saxony changed sides, and the entry of Sweden had offset the loss of Russia to the Allies. Thus, Sweden and Russia neutralized each other. Frederick was still quiescent. France, Spain and Bavaria actively continued the struggle against Maria Theresa, while the Battle of Dettingen and Russian Botta plot were capturing all the attention during the summer of 1743. Negotiations between the British, the Austrians and Piedmont Sardinians were proceeding quietly in the city of Worms. The Austrians were desperately afraid that Frederick II would soon be invading the Austrian domains again. Thus, the Austrians sought a separate peace with Piedmont Sardinia in Italy. Under the terms of the Treaty of Worms, which was signed on 13 September 1743, the Austrian Habsburgs surrendered all territory in Italy located west of the Ticino River and Lake Maggiore to Piedmont Sardinia. Additionally, some lands south of the Po River were also given to Piedmont Sardinia. In exchange, Piedmont Sardinia renounced its claim to Milan, guaranteed the Pragmatic Sanction and agreed to provide 40,000 troops for a joint Italian army to fight the Bourbons.